All right, joining me once again here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is Andy Kroll. Andy is a reporter for Mother Jones magazine, which you can find at motherjones.com. You can also follow him on Twitter at Andrew Kroll. Andy, thank you so much for being on the show again.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
All right, so Andy, you actually had a really interesting article up in Mother Jones recently on the history of subsidies to oil companies here in the United States. You actually found that there are three main types of subsidies. So do us a favor, start out by telling us about the three different types of subsidies, how they came into play, and how much they cost taxpayers.
Absolutely. So without going into too far down the wonk rabbit hole, you have a subsidy that's about $700 million to $3.5 billion every year, the cost of taxpayers. This is basically drillers writing off the expenses of drilling for oil, of sinking their wells into the ground and looking for the black gold. And that has been around for almost 100 years. And the wonky name for this is intangible drilling costs. But basically, it was a effort by the government to help oil drillers who were just drilling anywhere they could, and they didn't have the technology we have today to figure out where the oil was. So they were just sinking their wells and coming up dry in some places and striking gold in others. So that one has been around since 1916. You have something called the depletion allowance. Again, this thing has been around for almost a century. Congress introduced it to try to get more drilling, to try to, if you can believe that, to incentivize oil drillers. And this little perk cost taxpayers anywhere from $500 million to $1.1 billion, and it's almost like a tax depreciation, but it goes indefinitely for an oil company. So you can write off the equipment that you use and the expenses of drilling a well, and you can almost in some cases recoup the costs entirely of sinking that well and drilling for oil. And so this one again is the depletion allowance, and then more recently, this is from the mid 2000s, there was a big tax bill moving in Congress, and the oil and gas industry succeeded in basically lobbying its way into a loophole, allowing oil drillers to have a deduction for being domestic manufacturers. Just like a manufacturer of cars in the U.S. or refrigerators or computers, what have you, the oil and gas companies somehow, even though drilling oil isn't manufacturing oil, and you're incentivizing them for something that is here, and you can't offshore, or you can't send a well to China. You just go where the oil is. They nonetheless got this perk in 2004, and that's another $500 million a year. So these are the big three, almost, if you will, and they add up to many billions every year.
And what's crazy about this is, so essentially the two big ones where it's like any piece of equipment that they buy or any of the actual work, they can actually write that off and they can write off that and not pay any taxes on it. That's something that they could. So literally, if they buy a drill, no matter what, they get to write that off. If any actual work they're doing, they actually can. That stuff gets to work, and they get to do it every year. Essentially, that it gets to come off of their taxes every single solitary year.
Yep. That's absolutely right. And that's something that's been around, for many, 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 many years. Like I said, nearly a century. And maybe it made sense at one point when oil drilling was a risky business, very speculative. But again, the technology was pretty rudimentary about trying to find oil and getting it out of the ground. But obviously, this industry has gotten a lot more sophisticated over the years. Yet this tax perk that you describe is still hanging around.
Yeah, also the fact that by now, maybe back then we didn't understand the impact that drilling out these fossil fuels had on the climate.
Oh, not at all. Yeah.
we have the science to say, wait a second, we're doing all these gigantic subsidies on something that's actually going to be killing us in the near future.
Yeah, well, that's right, and that's a whole other thing. I mean, it's purely on economics, you can say that these tax perks don't make sense. But then you bring in the climate, you think it's an absolute no-brainer. I mean, you're incentivizing the people who pull fossil fuels out of the ground at exactly the time when we need to be keeping them there.
Yeah. So one of the things in the article, you actually go into why Washington, D.C., because again, this like you said, this is a no-brainer. This is something that really should stop, and not only should, in my opinion, not only should the subsidies stop, we should be doing everything we can as a planet to keep these fossil fuels in the ground. But you actually write about why politicians in Washington, D.C. will not touch these ridiculous oil subsidies. And again, we're talking about an industry that is unbelievably profitable. It's not like they aren't making money. I mean, a couple years ago, Exxon made the most money in the history of the planet. So we're talking about industries that's doing quite well. So let's go into why politicians in D.C. will not touch these subsidies here. You kind of talk about campaign donations, and let's talk let's start there and how much the oil industry actually pays into politicians' campaigns.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the most influential campaign donors and lobbying forces, in the country. Of any industry, and as I point out in the story, I mean, between 2000 and 2012, oil and gas industry has given more than $90 million, spent more than $90 million on campaigns. The vast majority of that to Republicans, 77 million for Republicans compared to 14 for Democrats. And over that same period, you have the amount of money, the solar, the wind, geothermal, those renewable energy companies have given in campaign cash is just minuscule. It's not even $6 million over that same period, 2000 to 2012. So the oil and gas industry is just a juggernaut when it comes to campaign spending, when it comes to playing the influence game in Washington.
And it's not just flat-out campaign donations to candidates. You also delve into the lobbyist machine that's behind it, and also a bunch of dark money that's being spent through PACs and stuff. Let's talk a little about that. Go into a little bit of detail about dark money and the lobbyists that the oil industry has.
Yeah, I mean, the oil industry uses every tool at its disposal when they're trying to defend what they've already got, which obviously they've been really successful at. Last 15 years, oil and gas industry has spent more than $1.4 billion with a B on lobbying. And, as I said, they spent more than $90 million on campaign cash. They use super PACs. They use trade associations. The American Petroleum Institute, API, has a multi-$100 million budget. And has fleets of lobbyists and flacks and PR people, and they're everywhere in Washington. I still get their emails, and I get many every single day. And then there are nonprofit groups, dark money groups as we call them here, the American Energy Alliance, and others that can take corporate money, and they can take it anonymously, and then spend that both on, talking about Solyndra or some other sort of issue, or specifically, critiquing a politician. I mean, the American Energy Alliance, for instance, was very critical of President Obama. They never said don't vote for him, but the ads were talking about gas prices and this and that. So they, oil money is everywhere, and they use every tool that they possibly can. For instance, Chevron gave $2.5 million to a Republican super PAC in 2012, which was a pretty big deal. And they give money to the Chamber of Commerce. Obviously, the oil companies are members there, so they're everywhere. They're as much as any industry is in D.C. The oil industry is everywhere.